media say the Ukrainian army has breached the first Russian defense line. They're writing that they're breaking through and that the Russians could get into serious troubles. This is some kind of the mainstream description of the situation. What's your assessment? What's your point on that? Are they breaking through the defense lines?
No. Look, how many times have we heard this sort of nonsense? Months and months and months. Ukraine is marching to victory. The Russians are incompetent, can do nothing right. I've heard this story so many times, and they're talking about Robotina right now, which is the focus. Robotina is almost as flat and devoid of people as Kansas in the United States. Whatever was there is gone. The most recent reports suggest that the Ukrainians have managed to sneak into that area at night, but only in armored vehicles for brief periods, and then they rush out as soon as possible because they don't want to be targeted and destroyed by the massive strike assets that are being used to pulverize the entire area. So no, there's no significant advance there whatsoever. Secondly, whenever the Ukrainians have approached the first line of defense, even gotten close to it, they've tried to snap a few photos, photo operation, make it look good, show that they've done something, and then they rapidly withdraw to get out of there because they have taken so many casualties. Remember that the defensive structure is as follows. You have what we would call a security zone in the West. It ranges from 10, 15 to 25 kilometers, depending upon where you are. You have to move through that security zone to really approach the first line of defense. Just getting through that security zone has cost Ukrainians, an estimated 60,000 dead now during the so-called counteroffensive, which has absolutely failed. In this case, they claim to have reached that first line of defense. The principal value of the first line of defense is that it prevents you from seeing the second line of defense, which means that you then become an easy target for destruction. They haven't broken through anything. They're not going to break through anything. They don't have the wherewithal or the capabilities. Everyone who's looked at this, who's remotely objective and not on the payroll for either the major cable news programs or the mainstream media, will tell you, we cannot break through these defenses unless you can eliminate the overhead Russian intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, which identify and target the Ukrainians. Right now, persistence, surveillance over Ukraine puts everything in Ukraine at risk. In other words, you can't go anywhere in that country without being observed. If you can be observed, you're going to be targeted. If you can be targeted, you're going to be hit with something. There's nothing the Russians can't target and destroy. We haven't been able to change that because we cannot destroy the overhead surveillance. Secondly, you've got to be able to counter the massive strike assets, which means you have to identify them and fire against them. Ukrainians can't do it. They don't have sufficient numbers of equipment. They don't have the ammunition. And everyone is looking at the Western equipment saying, well, it's behaving badly. The truth is the Western equipment is not bad, but it's in the hands of people who are unfamiliar with it. They're operating within a framework they don't know, and they don't have the requisite air and missile defense to prevent these forces on the ground from being destroyed. So the entire thing is a fiasco. Nothing is going to change unless the Russians want to change it. And thus far, the Russians have held 300,000 troops in reserve. They are moving very slowly up north and in the eastern part of Ukraine. I think they're going to eventually move further east and then north and probably surround Kharkov. But they're moving slowly, and they're allowing the Ukrainians to essentially sacrifice themselves in great numbers as they move forward up north. Meantime, the rest of the defensive line is intact, and the Russians are not rushing reinforcements anywhere. They don't need to.
How big are the Ukrainian losses? I mean, from this, we don't hear too much in our media. What are your numbers, and how do you make your own picture? Because it's very hard for us here in Switzerland, for example, to make our own picture. The media are always giving these victory reports, which seem to be a bit, as you described them, a bit off reality. how big are the losses of the Ukrainian forces? What do we have to calculate there?
Well, a few weeks ago, based on the reports that I've been getting from Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and some others in Eastern Europe, some Bulgarians who are in a position to observe either directly or indirectly and are able to talk to people on the ground. I've actually had people call me on cell phones from Ukrainian hospitals to tell me how desperate the situation is. I've tried to put that together along with the numbers of Ukrainian forces committed and then make an evaluation based on fresh graves that are being dug, announcements of deaths in newspapers, obituaries. And I came to the conclusion a few weeks ago that they'd lost 400,000 dead. Now, that's a lot of killed in action.
It's amazing.
Ukrainians have lost more people killed in action than the United States did during the entire Second World War. Let's stop and consider that for a minute. Americans have no idea what this is like. Then more recently, there were some advertisements about memorials services being held in Ukraine. And the initial advertisement said, "Come and remember the 400,000 who will never return." I think I sent you that. Well, not long after that came out and we had a chance to look at it, it was naturally removed. It had been a mistake. The Ukrainian national leadership got involved and said, take that down immediately because they've been trying to disguise the losses. Now I'm being told the numbers have grown. Now, I don't know. I don't follow this every day. If you try to, you're going to end up losing your mind because you have to sift through so many lies from the West, so much disinformation from the Ukrainians. And to be frank with you, the Russians don't say a great deal until something's almost over. So it's very hard to follow every day. I admire the people that try to do that. I tend to wait for a few weeks. And that's why I say this morning, I received information that the death toll for the so-called counteroffensive is over 60,000. If that's true, that would raise the number of 400,000 even higher. How much, I don't know. I don't know how much higher you have to raise that toll in order to be horrified by it. I've had enough. I see no point in this. The problem is, and this is very important for your listeners to understand, I think President Putin has always objected to any operation that would essentially destroy more Ukrainian lives unnecessarily. Therefore, he has been reluctant to unleash the offensive power of the Russian military establishment. He's held them back. That has conveyed the impression in the West that there must be something wrong with the Russians because they've obviously annihilated virtually all the things that are being thrown at them. There's not much left in Ukraine. We know that press gangs are operating in Western Ukraine to try and round up anybody they can find that seems remotely capable of carrying a weapon. At the same time, they're now pressuring the Poles to let their people come into Poland and arrest vast numbers of young men from Ukraine who have escaped to Poland. That's how desperate they are. I don't see how this can go on that much longer, but unfortunately, as long as we continue to provide weapons, they will find warm bodies to put against them. I would say until there's nothing left at all. That seems to be the plan of the regime in Kiev.
Have the Ukrainians still the manpower to continue, or are they using all their strategic reserves? Are they running out of personnel? What is your take there?
Well, that's my point. If you go into the Carpathians, where villages are now being raided for manpower, because we see a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have tried very hard to rely principally on people from rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And then secondly, they've tried to drain the coffers, if you will, in eastern Ukraine first before they stripped out the West. The problem is there have been millions and millions of Ukrainians that have rapidly left the country. Right now, they try to seal the borders. No one gets in and out without being thoroughly checked. No man of military age between, I would say, 16 and 60 is allowed to leave the country under any circumstances. And more recently, the Russians reported the capture of a 71-year-old Ukrainian man who was part of a tank crew that was opposing the Russians. I think they're already scraping the bottom of the barrel. They no longer have any standards. They've tried to empty the prisons. They're bringing people on board, I'm told, who have mental problems, who are psychiatrically incapable. I mean, this is a tragedy beyond anything that we in the West can imagine. And naturally, I think if more people in Germany and Switzerland and Austria and other Western countries knew the truth, they would demand an end to this.
But isn't it totally irresponsible for a leader of a country like President Zelensky, who is hailed like a saint, even in Switzerland, in our parliament? Isn't it totally responsible to sacrifice so many lives in a military operation, in a war, where you are saying it's absolutely impossible to win? The Russians are just too strong. Their defenses are too strong. Isn't that utterly irresponsible from a political standpoint?
Well, of course, but we have experience with this. We saw Stalin throw millions and millions and millions of lives away. We know that he executed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight against the Germans. At least 15 million Soviet soldiers were killed, and another 13 to 14 million civilians died. Stalin was a mass murderer on the same scale. We haven't seen that yet, but there's not much difference between him and Zelensky. The interesting thing about Hitler is that most of the heaviest losses occurred in the last 6 to 12 months of the war, when he seems to have decided to throw away life without compunction. But I don't think we've seen anything like this since probably Pol Pot in Cambodia. This is criminal. There's no question about it. But he was picked by this oligarch Kolomoisky, who's now supposedly being arrested for corruption, which seems a little late in the game. But Kolomoisky picked him, groomed him, and essentially installed him as president. Remember, Zelensky ran on a platform of peace and then rapidly turned in the opposite direction. This is a tragic set of circumstances, but one can only assume that Zelensky is doing what the people in Washington and London and probably Paris want him to do. And I'm told he has to be guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are lots of discussions in Ukraine, inside Ukrainian forces, about getting rid of Zelensky.
How do you explain the coverage of our media? I mean, they're so far away from these kind of analysis. They're still in some kind of victory mode. Well, somehow you see one or two articles in our media saying, well, the offensive is not going as well as expected. But what's your comment on the coverage of our mainstream media?
I urge everyone who asks the same question in the United States to look at the people who own the media, the people that control the financial system, the people at the top of the government. Who are they? Where did they come from? We have a ruling political class in this country that has emerged over the last 20 years. They've always been with us, but they've never been in power as they are right now. That is probably the most radically leftist elite that we've ever had. The so-called Republicans are at best controlled opposition. And those people listening to this who understand what the communist regimes were like in Eastern Europe will appreciate what that means. You in Europe have to do the same thing. Who are the people with the financial power to build up governments with their favored personalities, the people they like? Where are the people who have been governing you for the last 25, 30 years coming from? What do they represent? I think you're dealing with another class of people that emerged during the post-war years with a set of attitudes and values. And they're also beholden, I would argue, to many of the same people that ours are. You have not just domestic or national oligarchs with billions of dollars or euros at their disposal. You have international figures. These people are very difficult to defeat because they can buy up politicians, buy up political support. And in Washington, people are reluctant to tell the truth and to move to a different position until they see absolute evidence that the people that put them where they are can't harm them. In other words, people are afraid. Look what happens in much of Europe. You stand up and say, well, I think this war in Russia is wrong. Well, why? We have to destroy Russia. And somebody says, why? Well, Russia's evil. Well, why? It's not communist. Well, it's bad. Well, why? And you get the same thing. Well, if you talk like this, you have to be censored. In England, they're talking about putting people in jail. I mean, it's incomprehensible. incomprehensible. Talk about free speech. It's the antithesis of it. One wonders why we bothered fighting the last World War. It's appalling. So I can't tell you these 5 people are responsible in Germany or Switzerland or France. I'm telling you and the people listening, go find out who's bankrolled by whom. My experience is follow the money. If you follow the money, you'll get an answer.
How deep are the Americans involved in this war? Are they totally into it? Is Zelensky actually taking orders from Washington? How deeply are they involved?
Well, first of all, the average American is completely disinterested. I would argue the average American may or may not know very much about this thing called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Americans aren't even aware of the numbers of troops that we have on the ground today in Poland and Romania or in the Baltic littoral. Most Americans are concerned with their lives here in the United States. So let's separate the electorate, the majority of Americans who vote, from the government. The government is completely without accountability. They have established themselves in power over the last 2.5 years. They think that they have rigged the situation such that they can stay in power in perpetuity. I don't think they're right, but I think they truly believe that they now control all the levers of power and they have all the money they need, and everyone is going to have to go along with them whether they like it or not. So my point is that Americans are very involved in government with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And I think there are lots of American active and former military leaders, as well as British active and former military leaders involved on the ground. And they are giving the Ukrainians advice. And I think lots of Ukrainians have begun to question the validity of that advice. And when you push these people, they say, well, they need more. Next year will be better. I guess we can't win this year now, but we can win next year. Why? What leads anybody to this conclusion? It's sort of ridiculous nonsense. It just means more death and destruction in Ukraine. The question I keep asking is, surely Europeans are closer to the reality. They feel more affected. Why aren't they rising up and demanding hard answers? Well, perhaps part of it is because they're foolish enough to believe whatever the government says. I had hoped that 50 or 60 years ago, Europeans were cured of that malady. They don't seem to be. It especially disappoints me in Germany and Austria, less in Austria, because I think Austrians are now asking many of the right questions. And by the way, I don't understand why the Swiss have put their neutrality position at such risk.
I mean, this will be actually my final question. I just talked to a former NATO general who said Switzerland should stay out of NATO and should stick to neutrality. But we will get to that point at the end of our conversation. But let me ask you this about the United States, because they're absolutely crucial in this conflict. I mean, when the Americans decide it's over from the Western part. And the question we have here, also from a military perspective, do you think that the Americans will deliver these weapons? I hope I pronounced them correctly. ATACMS, we call them Marschflugkörper, cruise missiles. And the Germans are talking about those Taurus missiles. And Zelensky has promised, if I get these, I will not use them to target deep into Russia objectives. What is going to happen there? Are they delivering these weapons? Are you trusting Zelensky that is not going to escalate the war deep into Russia?
I think there is inside the current administration a split in attitude. On one hand, you have people that absolutely have thrown caution to the wind and have decided that whatever results in the destruction of Russia is a good thing, therefore give Zelensky everything. I don't think that they hold the majority opinion at this point. On the other hand, you have many people who are saying, based upon what we've seen thus far, the Ukrainians will use whatever they have to attack Moscow and other Russian cities if given the opportunity. And I think they know that. I am hopeful that cooler minds will prevail. ATACMS are essentially the same as your MLRS multiple rockets from the HIMARS, the High Mobility Rocket System, except they have a much greater range, but they're equally precise. I hope they don't, because as you move in this direction, you begin to leave the Russians with no choice but to do what? March west. And I keep warning people about this. Supposedly we were here involved to stop this offensive Russian nation from marching west to reconquer Eastern Europe. Well, there was no evidence for that. In fact, the Russian army was too small for the operation it was assigned to conduct. Putin didn't realize that because he thought he was simply sending signals to the West that would result in some sort of negotiated outcome. He was wrong. He grossly misjudged the reckless hatred that exists in Washington and London, I would argue in particular, for Russia. So now he's figured it out, but he's still holding back because he doesn't want a direct confrontation with NATO. I also think that he's watching carefully the economies, particularly in Western Europe and in the United States, and the financial system. And our financial system is very fragile right now. I don't want to get into a lengthy discussion, but many of your colleagues in the financial system are well versed in it and are watching carefully as our bond yields rise and the prices of our bonds fall because nobody wants to buy our treasury bonds. So now you're talking about banks at home and banks in Europe and banks around the world holding trillions in U.S. treasuries that are increasingly worth nothing because interest rates have risen and you're holding bonds that are just an anchor. So people at some point are going to say, we've got to shed these things, get rid of them. When that begins, the United States economy, and I would argue the rest of the Western economy, is in a lot of trouble. That's the tip of the iceberg. We haven't talked about all the other things. But I think Mr. Putin, who understands economics, is watching that carefully. And so he's saying, well, if I'm smart, instead of prosecuting this offensive all the way to the Polish border, I can wait for things to fall apart in Europe. If we have a cold winter, you know better than I do what the consequences could be in Central and Northern Europe. So I think these things are on his mind. But we don't seem to understand that if we press ahead and keep escalating, that at some point the Russians will say that's enough. We have no choice. And remember, this is existential for Russia. Ukraine is to Russia what Mexico is to us. What would we tolerate in Mexico? Would we tolerate Russian and Chinese influence building up Mexican forces to attack us? Would we tolerate their missile batteries capable of striking targets in the United States? Of course not. I can tell you the American people would go crazy. We'd flatten Mexico in a few hours without hesitation. Well, the Russians have been far, far more restrained than we would be, but that doesn't have to last. I think it's a great mistake to continue to pretend that Russia can't do these things. They absolutely can.
How close are we to a nuclear confrontation?
Russia and China have both essentially adopted a no first use position. The Russians will not initiate the use of any nuclear weapon unless they are struck first. And I take them seriously. I think the Russians and the Russian population have a far more realistic view of just how destructive those weapons are than we do at the moment. I think for some reason people in Washington dismiss such a possibility. We have bullied so many countries for so long through our financial system, militarily, through our interventions. We don't seem to understand the dangers of confronting a major power that can fight back. After all, what have we been fighting for the last 20 plus years? People with AK-47s, command detonated mines, in sandals and bed sheets. We haven't fought any opposing armies or opposing air forces. None of our opponents have had any air or missile defense. We're confronted with something very different right now. We don't seem to understand that. We need to wake up and wake up quickly and stop pretending that we have an upper hand in this. We do not. And again, it's back to the Mexico analogy. What chance would the Russians and the Chinese have against us in Mexico? None. And what do we realistically have against them in Ukraine? None. You don't fight your enemy on the enemy's doorstep. That's stupid. And we continue to do this.